Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to look at another advanced feature of awk, and that is the use of variables. So we're going to continue to build on your capabilities with awk by allowing you to use variables in your expressions. Now this is a somewhat more advanced feature, and being able to use it requires you already understanding a number of other advanced features, in particular things like the ability to use multiple expressions, and those two special conditions begin and end, since we sort of need those to be able to do anything useful with a variable. I do already have videos on those topics, so do feel free to check those out and come back. When we want to create a variable in awk, it's quite simple. We don't need to actually specify a type. We just say name equals value. And now we have a variable with that name storing some value. Typically, you'll probably want to set that initial value once and then update it as the script goes on, perhaps based on what it reads out of the records that it's reading. So this would commonly be done in the begin expression. For example, we'd run our awk command, and we'd use that begin special condition and say some variable is 0, or maybe an empty string, or something like that. So I'm going to use the same cars file that I've been using for my other examples. So we could, before we read any lines from the file, set a total value to 0. And then as we read through our list of cars, add to the total value. Alternatively, instead of setting the variable in begin, you could instead use the -v option for awk and just specify the variable that way. In begin, you could actually give multiple instructions, so you could set up multiple variables that way. With -v, you could just use that -v option multiple times to set multiple different variables, whichever way you want to make that work. Once you have your variable set up, you can then, in your other expressions, use things. Well, you can still use your assignment operator, that equal sign, to just completely overwrite the value, but you can also use plus equals or minus equals to, well, update the value in an expression. So if we wanted to get the total value of all of those cars, well, we could call our awk statement and in begin set that variable total value is 0. As awk reads through each record, update that variable, so add the value of that 5th field to the variable, and at the end, once awk is done reading all of the records, just print out the total value is whatever we calculated. This, again, if you want to do this with -v, you could absolutely do that way. Instead of saying begin and the total value is 0, just -v, total value is 0. So I do have these in my recent history. Oh, that's the one with the -v. And as we can see, all it does is print out the total value of all cars is 74,600. If we cat cars.txt, you could sit there and do the math. It is going through and updating that value as it goes. I'm not going to sit here and calculate that in front of you. I guarantee you it's right. If we want to do this with begin, it also displays the total value of all cars is 74,600. Now, an advanced feature on top of this is, well, there's a pretty good bet you're going to be calling your awk command from inside another scripting language, that you'll be using awk to, take advantage of these nice calculation and text manipulation capabilities that it has, but perhaps taking advantage of the command line uses of another script, or another scripting language, that is. However, getting your variables from that other scripting language into awk can be a little difficult if you don't know the easy way to do it. The easy way to do it, though, is use -v to set up a new awk variable and just feed it the value of your, I'm going to use Python, variable. That way, when you're giving awk the value of that variable, it's outside those single quotes that awk is going to use, so we don't have to worry about balancing out so many different sets of quotes. So for example, in Python we might call os.system and use that to make a call to awk, pass it the variable make, and what we're really doing when we call this os system is here's a string, awk space -v make equals end of string, add the string that is the variable car, whatever we currently have stored in car, and concatenate that with this other string that is the rest of our awk expression. I'll show you this in a file. So nice, simple Python script where I use Python to prompt the user, which manufacturer would you like to see? Based on what the user inputs, I then call my awk, and I'm actually going to VI this so I can just put in a comment to show you what I mean about combining the string. What is really happening here when it actually does call os.system, it is eventually saying -v make equals, and Python will deal with combining the value of whatever is currently in carmake into this existing string. So when I get prompted, if I were to type in Ford, when os.system actually runs, it would see -v make equals Ford, and then -f car report cars.txt. So this way, combining our variable into our awk string gets handled by Python. You could do a very similar thing in Bash or other scripting languages as well. So I'm actually going to quit without saving because I don't want to accidentally save that. And if I were to call, shouldn't even need /. I should be able to say carprint.py. What manufacturer would you like to see? How about Ford? Car report. That should be carreport.py. Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to look at another advanced use of awk, and that is the ability to use variables. So this is going to be another quite advanced feature that will allow you to use variables in your awk expressions to allow you to do much more useful things with this command. Now this does tie together a number of the features that I've discussed in my other videos, so there is the expectation that you're pretty familiar with awk by this point and you know how to use a number of its features. In particular, the ability to use multiple expressions, the ability to use those special begin and end conditions, and even, in some of my demonstrations, the ability to run awk scripts from a file. I do have videos on all of those, so do feel free to go check those out if you're a little rusty on those topics. Initially, you do have to set some value in your variable. It's quite simple. You give it a name equals some value. Typically, you want to do this kind of initialization just once to set a value right off the bat. So this would commonly be done in the begin expression. So you could awk begin some variable equals whatever initial value you want to give it. So before awk looks at any of the source data, here's this variable. I'm going to continue using that cars sample file that I have been in my other videos. So if we were going to calculate the total value of all of those cars, we would need to start that variable as 0. Alternatively, instead of using that begin expression, you could do this with the option -v and do this outside of your single quotes for the awk expressions. This works just as well. Both of these allow you to create one or more variables. If we wanted to do this with -v, multiple variables, you just use -v multiple times, one per variable. If you wanted to set up multiple variables in begin, you just use multiple instructions, like I covered in another video. Once you have that variable set up, in your other expressions, you could then use things like plus equals, minus equals, or even just equals to update or overwrite the value of that variable. That way, you can start making changes to that value, whatever is stored in that variable, as awk parses through the data. So this is why we really needed those multiple expressions. We could awk begin total value is 0, so set the value to 0 to begin with. As we go through each record, add in the value of the fifth field. So add the value of that car to the variable we've stored. And then at the end, we can print the whole thing out. I do have this done a second way. Instead of using begin, you could use -v. Let's see this in the command line. I do have these in my command history. There we are. So awk begin total value is 0. Then for each record, add the fifth field into that total value. Once you're done with all the records, at the end, print the total value of all cars is some value. And it prints out the total value of all cars is 74,600. If we can't cars.txt, I'm not going to sit here and calculate that. You could either calculate it yourself or take my word that it does in fact add up to 74,600. Instead of doing awk begin, we could say awk -v and initialize the variable that way. The end result is effectively the same. There is a reason we might prefer to use -v though, and here's why. It's a reasonable bet that sometimes that you're going to be calling awk, you will be doing so from some scripting language. I use it a lot with Bash and Python. It is very powerful, as I keep saying, for filtering and manipulating text, for generating reports. But, I'd like to use the capabilities of those scripting languages to do things like get command line input, to get values from the user, to read something else out of a file, whatever it is that I want to do. So if you don't know the easy way to get a variable from that other scripting language into awk, it can be quite cumbersome because you have to balance out quotes and escape quotes, and it just becomes difficult to manipulate it all. But the easy way, though, is to use that -v option. That way, it gets dealt with outside of the single quotes that define the awk expressions, so we don't have to worry about balancing those quotes. So for example, using Python, if I were to make an os.system call, I'm passing it a string that is awk-v make equals, and then I'm just combining in another string that is a Python variable that stores the make of the car or the manufacturer. And then I'm just concatenating another string, which is my actual awk instructions, or expressions, pardon me. Just make sure that there's no space between, around the equal sign. Let's see this in a file. No, it was car print I set this in. carprint.py. So it's a simple Python script where I grab the OS module, I get some input from the user, which manufacturer would you like to see, and then I make this os.system call, awk-vmake, add in whatever it is that user answered to our prompt, add in, well, call that car report file. So when I call this, actually before I do that, I'm just going to go in, well, no, I'll run it first. carprint.py, and it prompts me, which manufacturer would you like to see? I'll use Ford, because we have several of those. And, well, for each one it printed out a value, and then it, at the end, printed out all of them. How did it do that? Well, if we take a look at, I didn't want to show that yet. I wanted car print. We will go back to that file in a second. When I ran this script, what it did, before it actually said os.system, it had to evaluate this string. So it said, well, it converted that into awk-vmake. I just can't type today. -vmake. I should have just copied that line, shouldn't I? There we are. So before it calls the actual os.system call, it takes whatever the user answered to this input, which is now stored in that variable carMake, and it turns this string into that. So when awk gets run, it already thinks that value is Ford, or whatever else the user put in. Now, of course, we're expecting, we're relying on the user to put in some useful data, but when they do, okay, that's not useful data. We get useful output. So if we take a look at the car report file, there it is. I've got 3 expressions. I set up that total value. When the first field matches the make, that is the variable we just retrieved from Python, we print out the model and the value. We update the total value. For the other records, we don't do anything. And at the end, the total value of all of the whatever make cars is this total value. We could even go a little bit more complicated. If I call carprint2.py, which I'll show you in a second, which would we like to see? Ford. Now, I'm even calculating the average value. My Python script really doesn't change much. Helps if I show you the right file. carprint2. I'm still prompting the user, which manufacturer do you want to see? I'm still taking that variable, putting it into my awk string, and I'm just calling a different awk file. If we take a look at that, so in my begin, I'm setting up 2 variables. In my expression where I try to match the make that the user entered, yeah, I print the 2nd and 5th field, I add to the total value, and I'm updating this other variable to keep track of how many cars matched that make, so that at the end, when I print out the total value of all of those cars is whatever value, I can then calculate the average and print the average. So a nice simple use of a lot of what I talked about in this series of awk videos. Just a note, if you are going to pass a variable into awk like that, any changes you make to that value in awk do not affect the variable in the originating scripting language. So if I were to do something in carprint2.py, if inside car report I update this variable make, that does not affect car make, because by the time awk sees this value, it's only seeing, well, the value that was stored there, not the actual variable. If you wanted to update the value itself, maybe I would use something like os.popen and return the value, though that would only work for a single variable. So what we've looked at in this video is how we can use variables in awk. This combined many of the other topics that I've already covered in awk to allow us to do things like track data, to make complicated calculations, to get variables from another scripting language, maybe something the user entered on the command line, and make calculations with the data stored in our actual data files. I will do another video after this, just one last thing to show something a little bit more complicated than awk can do, just to show you how powerful it really can be, just to tie together all of what we've looked at here. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.